Hello and welcome to StudioSense. Today we are heading off to Bryce Canyon National Park, one of the five mighty national parks located in Utah. And we're going to do a rather complicated pastel and this is forewarning you, this is a 2 hour video, actually 2 hours and 10 minutes. I would invite you to take a break, look at it the next day, speed it up if you'd like. There's several key concepts that we want to cover here. First of all, Bryce Canyon offers beautiful complementary colors, orange and blues and red and greens, and we're going to convey those in the painting, as well as the atmospheric perspective. As we head toward that horizon, everything disappears and fades out. A lot of lines and angles in this painting, which we'll work through, and edges are really key. Soft edges, hard edges, hidden edges, you name it. We got lots of edges at Bryce Canyon National Park, and really, I think you'll really enjoy the scenery here, and it's really fantastic. I've got a bunch of reference photos spending about a week here in October 2024. But we have to start with our homework. Homework is here you could see a grayscale sketch on the upper left, the line drawing that picks up most of the contours in the landscape photo reference photo, and a simple notan. So I'm going to start here and go real quickly here with a blue sky. And what I like to do at the horizon is of course lighter in value than the top of the sky or the zenith. So I take this very hard pink pastel, it's a Mount Vision pastel, very light pink, and cross that off, scumble it across, so a little bit of lighter blue down there, and my trusty hands go ahead and blend it all together. I like to do this, I call this the pure sky. Blend with your hands, don't do any underpainting in the sky, don't do anything fancy, just lay the pastel as you need to. So homework is done, the sky is done, a little bit of sliver of sky because there's so much landscape to capture in this view. We're going to start from the top and work down. As you can see, the reference photo there on the left, there's a long ridge far in the distance, plateau if you will, and of course from an atmospheric perspective it's very blue. It loses a lot of the colors of the spectrum, but blue remains and blue it is. So we'll lay that out, a little bit dark there, and similarly similar uh, um, structures in the landscape, hills, distant hills, and other plateaus are evident, but what we'll be really careful here, because there's such a complicated painting, is we're going to make sure that that distance and even the middle ground is softer than the sharpness of the hoodoos at Bryce National Park. And you're going to have to check into what a hoodoo is. I'll share a little bit of information about what a hoodoo is at Bryce National Park. And it's really a result of erosion. A plateau was established in the area, just like that plateau in the distance, and just through erosion and uplifts of the North American plate, and but mostly erosion. All these little walls that were built that got dug into kept eroding and breaking apart. And a hoodoo is basically like a spire or a tower, and you can see that in the reference photo. I'd highly encourage you to go visit Bryce National Park. So here, as we're getting closer to the foreground, we're not quite even in the middle ground really at this point in time. The values are a little bit darker, but again, there's a lot of blue and even a fair amount actually green grasslands in that area. So we'll bring in some greens in there, very muted greens, and some ochre type colors in the distance to capture that area. I took here a hard white pastel, very hard pastel, to help again soften that distance. So this gives you that kind of hazy look, and it will help mute out those colors. And again, because we want that to be contrasted with the bold colors of the foreground. So I'm starting with the foreground. What I want to do here is I wanted to get that background done first, because in the reference photos you could see there's some trees on the right side of the photo. So in order to place those trees in here, I needed to do something about that background. So I needed to at least capture most of that background as it is currently, and then I'll clutter that up once I add that hill, this particular cliff, as well as the trees in the foreground. Again, this will be an area that'll show really deep contrast to the distance. Gradually, as we go through this painting, the distance will be softened up and cooled off with a little bit more white and very, very light blue pastel. And the foreground will be really strong and deep, deep and dark. The foreground, in terms of the colors, the hues, are very dark, dark browns at this point in time, but in this particular scene, but also recognizes there's a lot of shade in this area. So I'll bring in this very deep brown pastel. Some of my favorite pastels are, I really like the Mount Vision pastels. They're a larger pastel. They're rather economical in terms of price, and you could get all kinds of sets. You could get. I've got a recently picked up a chromatic set. As you can imagine, how what the chroma of those colors look like. It's really fantastic, and another landscape set. So let's get back to looking back at the reference photo. Now you'll notice that Bryce Canyon has a lot of orange in it, a lot of reds and orange, and those proliferate through through the landscape. So blending in some of that orange, and then heading to use isopropyl alcohol. This, I think, is about a 70% solution isopropyl alcohol. Using this to cover the tooth of the paper, but not too much. So really, by doing the underpainting, it saves tooth for future layers of pastel. And I know I had a dark area in here, so I like to kind of get the darkness all blended in and spread in here with the alcohol and a stiff brush. And then at this point, I think I've got enough in that background. I'll add to that background gradually, but not too much. But I want to get those trees in that are also, pretty much in dark shade. The sunlight is coming from the right, but kind of like in the rear. So it's capturing the peaks and the edges of the hoodoos and a lot of the distant light, but it's not emanating very much into this area except for a few areas of sunlight. So I added a little bit of dark blue. I added some purple behind these pines, and now I'm bringing in really just a dark blue to roughly stroke in the shapes of the pine tree branches, and there's that dark blue, and also applying that dark blue to help balance out the blues to a different area of the painting, from top there down to down below into the shaded areas. So I like to do that balancing of color. If I have a color in one part of the painting, I'd like to get that color and find a home for it in another part of the painting, and that kind of helps balance out and is simply more pleasing for the composition of the painting. So I'll go back and forth here with this deep blue, and also I'll go ahead with the stiff brush and just brush strokes it out to help spread the branches, and also with a very stiff brush. This is just an old brush I used to use oil painting. It also helps to spread the leaves, stretch those branches even a little bit further, and soften up the edges, by the way, by pushing that brush across. So I'm pretty pleased with how this is turning out. A little bit of a variety of shapes of pine trees. So when you think of a composition, and remember I did my homework, so I had dark areas of the painting and I had light areas of the painting. You'd like to kind of get things set up so that you have a balance of lights and darks and middle values. Sometimes, I've looked at some artists and I think they've done a great job. I've looked at Mark Boedges. He does a lot of national parks and nature paintings, landscapes, and I've been observing his oil paintings, and he it often takes lights and darks in thirds, like a third light and two-thirds dark, or vice versa. The painting here, so at this point in the landscape, and this is the Bryce Canyon Overlook at Bryce Canyon. There's shuttle buses that go along go throughout the national park to various stops, and this is off at the most beautiful site, I believe, of the park. But I'm going to need to start carving out some of those lines. I don't want to lose the lines, so I'm going to start either painting them with pastel or spreading it out with the brush. Because as I paint, I may lose some of those lines, so I want to keep those edges. This line I'm doing now, I think, no, I'm not doing it yet. I'll be doing this shortly, but I want to make sure I set up, and here it is now. This is the edge of the tops of the hoodoos. So again, looking at that reference photo, there are rounded hills behind the hoodoos that go out several miles, but I wanted to at least get to the edge of the hoodoos so we don't lose track of them. So here I'm taking a blue pastel, and again, not I don't want to lose those lines, so I'm outlining the upper outside portion of the rounded hills that are just behind the hoodoos, just to block in some blue, because again, that middle area is going to have a lot of blue areas to it. In the foreground, it's a different kind of rock structure, and I frankly don't know what it's called, but I think it's other sandstone, but it's a light kind of a whitish beige um, rock structure. The shaded areas, um, it's pretty much shaded, and I like to use blues in the shade, and I'll pick up a little bit of purple here. So here again, I've blocked out lines or sections of the landscape consistent with the line drawing that I had done. And I'm going to just kind of reiterate that it's really important to do that homework. Planning the painting with a small scale version of the painting, which I did, of the pastel, which I did, and using pan pastels. I also, of course, the notan and the grayscale and the line drawing are important. So do your homework, because recently I found a reference photo I was thinking of painting, and I did a small scale version of it on simple Strathmore paper, charcoal paper actually, and used pan pastels, and I didn't really care for it. So I'd rather fail at that level rather than create a 12 by 16 or even larger painting and find out that I just don't like it. It doesn't seem to work. So I'm still lining up, working with those lines again, emphasizing some of the highlights on the right side of the edge of the dark hill that's off to the right. So we want to get that. Um, don't want to lose the fact that there's going to be a nice little orange glow there. So we've got this foreground hill worked out, and there's on top of the blues, I brought in a little bit of a mauve color. If you look at the reference photo, you can see some of that. And there's some darker areas and lighter areas that are picking up some of the sunlight. Some of the sunlight's kind of rounding around or bouncing over those rocks, which we'll want to convey in a bit later on as we work further details here. Picking up, some of the color that's on the hill behind those pines. Don't want to forget about that. And you're also trying to build some. I'll be building some graduated values in the distance. We're going to get more to the distance. We'll spend a fair amount of time here in the middle ground. Probably I call it the top. Maybe let's call it the top 40% of the painting, just to get the top section done and out of the way, because we're going to really spend a fair amount of time building up the collection of hoodoos in those dark alleys and very dark shaded areas, and ultimately adding so much orange, bright orange sunlit highlights to it, which will really be a lot of fun. Typically I'll work top down on the canvas, top to down on the canvas. I mentioned that earlier. Today I did take a bit of an exception, but that's what I'll usually do. Um, but at the same time, to break my rule again, often I will step back, look at a painting, take some notes, and sometimes I'll look at the painting in a digital image later on or the next day on my computer and add some notes and then have an action plan that says these are the next 2 or 3 things I want to do for this painting. And it could be that I'm doing a different part of the painting rather than working from top down. So I guess in the end of the day, I kind of work the whole thing and change directions, but whatever feels right. Again, this is a lot of fun stuff to do, so we want to enjoy it. Get closer to the foreground, you're getting darker. You're getting darker. This is actually a dark green forested area there. So we're going to work on filling that back in, but I wanted to kind of layer in what is it going to look like with the with those complementary colors of the hoodoos. And look at that in terms of that dark. It's a very dark blue green behind the hoodoos out in the middle ground. So I really like picking up some of that color, and this is a very chromatic color. So if I'm bringing in my chroma, that's really why I want to do it is in this foreground, um, in the hoodoo section, but not in the very foreground with the hill and the shaded areas. So again, it's really how you want to emphasize certain portions of the landscape and draw the viewer's eye into certain areas. So even the trees will contrast nicely with the red orange rock, and I'll be bringing in more greens in the pine trees in a little while. This is also a unison pastel. It's a green blue pastel. Now look at that. Look carefully at that contrast of hue with the orange hoodoo and the blue behind it. That's actually was one of the fun things about this painting, even though it is rather complicated. And we don't want to paint every detail. We'll just go crazy with that. So as you can see with the hoodoos, what we'll end up doing is putting in some detail in there, certainly through emphasis, through highlights, or some dark shaded areas. But we'll try to resort from creating every single hoodoo in the landscape. Blending with the hand helps also with that haziness that you could see in the middle ground. So we've got that. We're placing that in now. And just look at that contrast then with the orange. And as we lighten up that orange, it'll even be more of an emphatic contrast. So I decided to throw a little bit of catching the sunlight there with some bright orange up there just to for a little bit of pleasure in working on the painting. By the way, I had a bit of a lighting issue with the studio, so you're going to see a few changes here and there with the blue lights and the warm lights. Hopefully, it will not impact the. Actually, I don't think it will impact at all the lesson here. Again, there's more deeper blue, not very deep blue, um, uh, plateaus in the distance. And as I mentioned before, in the old uh, Bryce Canyon, Bryce Canyon, how hoodoos were creating is really the weathering. Weathering was broke down the rocks and the erosion of the rocks, and so those plateaus just just weathered over time, and most of the rocks are either limestone, dolostones, mudstones, siltstones, and sandstones. So a lot of soft stuff. And as the weather changes, snow, rain, you're going to get that erosion. Then you're going to get the hoodoos to kind of break down, or the walls that are developed to start breaking down. So back to the painting here. So there's definitely green in that distance too. So what I'm using again another Mount Vision pastel, sort of a muted green, green ochre color to that distance, and then I'll soften it up and do some blending. Now, this here, one could think of it as a river, and it could be a river, but frankly, it's not a river. It's the green that you see there, and here's the blending tool from my pan pastel sets to help soften up and blend in some of that light green into the blues. But the green layers is actually it's a plateau, and the blue is the slope down from the plateau into a valley. So um, it's not a river, but who knows? It probably is filled with water. There is a beautiful river there in the area. There's a place called Moss Cave that you could visit, and there's a river with a waterfall and all that cool stuff. But this is a valley, and we'll work on that further. We'll darken parts of it and lighten other areas that are picking up some sunlight. So I find the pan pastels are very good for blending. The soft tools are called are great for blending, especially in the distance and to get that atmospheric effect. There's distant ridges with shaded areas, and there's some highlights in those ridges we're going to want to pick up where they're capturing some sunshine. So we'll just kind of go um, back and forth on that. Some folks have asked me, do how much faith do I put in the reference photo? And so a couple of comments there. First of all, and there's a video I'd encourage you to watch as to what I do with my photographs because I do modify them. I take digital images and I'll either saturate them or I'll move some objects around, add a tree here and there or a rock, and I'll make changes. And in fact, one example is a cloudy day that I turned into a sunny day by using some of the support from the digital photography editing tools. But anyway, don't need to do a perfect replica of the scene. You're going to want to rearrange a few items just to get that composition effective enough to really draw the viewer in and really focus on, build those focal points. And that's a good question. The point I want to raise here is what is the focal point of this painting? Well, we don't know yet, and it will be that peak there in that hoodoo, that tall hoodoo there at the edge of the blue will be the focal point. So a little more depth in the lower portions and the shaded portions of the plateau. So I'm applying a darker blue back there, and I'll soften those up a bit too. Again, we don't want too much sharpness back there, given that it is a distance. So so really what I like to do when I'm looking at a painting, I don't want to do a replica of the scene. What I want to do is I want to pick up characteristics that kind of evoke mystery in the landscape. And the hoodoos gave me the opportunity to create that mystery here. And yeah, you can shape the landscape into something new. You don't want to do cliche material either on your landscapes. You could kind of think of the hoodoos are a cliche, but they're so unique that I couldn't resist painting them. But what are cliches like waterfalls, barns, a lot of the same things that you got. If you're working on a pastel and you want to submit it for a juried show, I would encourage you to think about something unique about what to present, and then a unique style and approach. So more of these muted mid-value greens to help build that distance. What we'll end up with, because as I was working on this painting, I was thinking I really want this whole piece of sanded paper covered and done with. Get it at least started, cover it all up. And I was thinking of splitting this video in half at the halfway point when I do have it fully covered up, because obviously now you can still see blank sanded paper. This is UART 400 sanded paper, by the way, which I really enjoy using for these landscapes. And And the pastels, as I mentioned, I'm using a variety of unisons, Rembrandts, Great American Artworks, and senneliers, or and unisons. Did I say unison? I don't recall if I did. But that's my collection, and no pastel is small enough. See, this one here is a tiny, very light, kind of like um, a beige color. But I want to build some of that highlights the right along that. We'll call that the valley rather than the river, but the ground is lighter, so I want to pull in some lighter pastel to help emphasize that. I kind of went back and forth with this hill, this um, plateau in the background. There are some pretty sharp edges out there, but I didn't want to make them too sharp. So the blending helped, and just remember to keep them so much softer than your foreground. I mean, I've seen paintings. Some students would have, kind of like the boldness of the distance is the same as in the foreground, and oh, we have to fix that and lighten up that background, etc. Parts of that valley are darker than other parts, so again, my little trusty dark blues will help here layer in a little bit of variety there. Regarding detail, I think we want to have suggestive detail at certain points. Keep your composition simple, and but have some suggested details. So let the viewer kind of say, yeah, that's this or that's that. Um, not too many distractions. We don't. We like. I always like my paintings to have just a couple of tips I like to look for when I design my paintings. A noteworthy angle of view could be really cool. The law of unequal proportions. So heavier darks and lighter lights. So a third light, two-thirds dark, and with some mid values in between, etc. I've spoken before about the palette knife. This is a plastic palette knife. I think it comes in really handy with blending and spreading out color. Um, and it does not pick up the pastel, which is good because a tortillon will pick up some of your pastel. So I kind of like using this palette knife. The distance here in that uh, in that plateau is picking up sunlight, so I'm bringing in a kind of a light mauve, almost pinkish Mount Vision pastel to um, delineate those highlights, and I'll probably light them up even a little more. And we'll see that in various areas of that middle ground. Another one of my style preferences is using vibrant and sometimes unique color and juxtapositioning complementary colors. That's a fun thing to do. I am rounding out, by the way, I'm rounding out those hills. So there's three or four distinct rounded hills behind the hoodoos, but in front of that distant middle, green, blue area. And they have the ability of being very distracting in this painting. I almost wish that they weren't there, and I kind of thought about maybe I'll move them. I'll get them out of here and try something else for that middle ground. So the issue is they're reasonably strong. They're shaded on the left, and so that's because from the direction of the sun coming from the right. So I'll build this shaded area. As you can see, it was a kind of a dark orange, and I'll even later on I'll go ahead and I'll darken that even further. But there's shaded areas I wanted to begin marking, and again for the sake of filling up the paper, I at least wanted to get something put in for these particular hills. But they really presented a challenge in the photograph because they conflicted with the hoodoos. So at the end of the day, I'll be doing two things. One is I will soften these up a bit, just kind of like what I did with that distance there, but not as much because it's really a lot closer to us than that far distance. But then at the same time, I'm sharpening up and making more vibrant the hoodoos. And that helps push those hills back further away from the excitement of the hoodoos. So that's what I'll end up doing. This is kind of like a little bit of a childish exercise here by just getting some of this pastel down, and then I'll continue to work the details. But this particular view presented so many opportunities to convey complementary colors next to each other that that it was just a blast. Orange and blues, reds and greens, and I also have a favor of pink, bringing pink in my paintings, especially with these rocks because there are pinkish colors. There's reds in the rocks, of course, orange, etc. With sunlight coming in from the right, we're going to have a little bit of light on those hills, on the right edge of those hills, and also some sunlight down at the bottom. And there's a green, there's a lot of greenery below the hills too, and there's greenery on the hills, which will eventually add trees on the hills, etc. So um, we'll just finish blocking this in. And so if you're interested in this reference photo, and here's the green, and again, there's your opportunity for red and green contrast, complementary color contrast. So there you go again, more fun. And we'll bring some of that green up into the shade and do a little bit of that color balance. But anyway, if you would like this reference photo, feel free to email me, and happy to do it yourself or work on it. But it's just a wonderful photo, and you could also, since it'll be digital, you can also hone in and focus in certain areas that you might want to paint separately, like maybe a little cluster of hoodoos or some other area in this particular painting. So jumping back to the hill in the front. Again, I want to line it out because I don't want to lose my lines. And there's this real interesting outcrop. It's not as emphasized in the photo. So this is one change I made to the photo because I wanted some object to really pick up some sunlight outside of the hoodoos that'll also show contrast with the hoodoos. So I will work that further, but I wanted to outline it first. All right, so now the complicated start part is starting. So we've got shade in those hoodoos. There's dark crevices and dark alleys between the hoodoos, down at the base of the hoodoos. So I bring in a very dark blue pastel. Again, of course, it's Mount Vision pastel. It is one of the chromatic dark blues. So I'm going to apply that here in various jagged areas, jagged shapes. It's a lot of erratic patterns, but let's get that in here first, and then we'll kind of worry about turning it into a real a real painting. Because right now it's just like a little exercise here. But I'm in favor of, and you might have seen some of my other videos where I use acrylic underpainting, and I actually like doing that too. And I chose not to do acrylic in here, and I'm really not sure why, but I would usually use a deep blue acrylic for shaded areas like this with rocks. Now, of course, these blues are not real blue, but there's sort of little orange, a very dark orange, and reddish brown color in there. So I'm going to do the same there and overlay that over these deep blues. But I'm going to take my brush and the rubbing alcohol again, or the isopropyl alcohol, and I'm going to start melding those into the tooth of the paper, spreading them out a little bit, just going back and forth. And then from there, we'll start layering on some of the colors. So again, the alcohol helps save the tooth, and you can add more layers on top of it. And it also helps you kind of convey the what it looks like if you, because when you apply alcohol on a spot, it makes it darker until it dries up, and you can say, hey, that's kind of like what I want. I want it to be dark like that, and it'll force you to go back and get a different pastel to make it darker. So it could help with the composition. It can help with the value characteristics of the painting. Already we have a contrast of composition here. These sharp edges really conflict, and that's on a good thing. That's a good thing with the roundness and softness of the rest of the painting. When I design a painting, excuse me, I like to think about how I could create some really awesome lighting and atmospherics, and this painting will give me the opportunity to create lighting more so than what was visible in the reference photo. Here, as I mentioned before, on top of the dried rubbing or isopropyl alcohol, I'm bringing in very dark orange brown. This is a Rembrandt, a hard pastel Rembrandt. I'm just going to scumble that over somewhat on the pattern that I just spread out with that deep blue pastel. I use the side of the pastel. I think that's really the best way of doing it. Take really sharp strokes. Then you layer on lighter values. I'll bring in more orange near the tops of these hoodoos. That'll help pick up the sunlight. The colors themselves for the hoodoos, what I used is I used a variety of mauves, pinks, purples, deep blue shade as you saw, orange, and various shades or values of orange. Deep brown orange, red orange, middle value orange, vibrant orange. There's all kinds of opportunity to use orange pastels because I have a lot of those. So there's certainly a color in your collection that you've got a lot of, and I've got a lot of orange. So I got a lot of pink too, but I don't think I could ever use all the pinks that I have. So this is a Rembrandt pastel. This is one of the vibrant oranges here, and I'm going to just kind of at least note some of the tips of the hoodoos and bring that orange down a little bit into the shaded or the darker value areas, the darker oranges of those particular hoodoos. Just trying to be consistent across the spectrum here of hoodoos. Now that area back there, that will be the focal point, so we're going to work that up a little bit. There are rock striations in the rocks at Bryce National Canyon, just representing different layers of geology. Um, the palette knife will also help blend, in this case, um, the transitioning values of the hoodoos. So we'll do a little bit of spreading out here. This helps also expand the strokes as well as helping with the value transitions. I have a pan pastel set that's got variety of orange also, and I just decided again I want to get this tooth covered up on this sheet of paper, so I'm just going to fill in some blanks, and we'll go back to those later on and work a little more detail with them. Some color combinations that I like, uh, juxtaposing different hues like purple and green are cool if you've done that. Pink and blue are really neat. So, do you ever think about putting those two colors together in a composition in a painting would be neat. Notice how I'm carving around that rock, that outcrop of rock that I want to highlight. Um, and one could argue that that's actually the focal point too. So if a painting ever had two focal points, it's that rock and then the distant peak hoodoo back there, and everything else is kind of um, separate, if you will, to the to the rest of the painting. There's a wall back there. It's kind of like an edge of a. It's like a purplish orange wall that really hasn't broken down and eroded so much. There's erosions where there's actually windows formed at uh, Bryce Canyon National Park between the hoodoos. So the hoodoos have literally have windows in them from the erosion. It's really interesting to see. But again, I want to fill up the tooth. I want to kind of get this. I want to get this done. I get some color in here. Get some. Almost doesn't matter what the value is right now. I just want to fill up the paper because I know I've got more to do. I've got more hoodoos to add. I've got more highlights to add. So let's just kind of keep this rocking and rolling. And some of the hoodoos, they'll be hardly seen. Like if you have a shaded area, use a middle value for a hoodoo, just like that. The stroke that I just put down, which was not a bright orange, but it was kind of like a middle value orange. And it seems to fit well in that spot. In the reference photo, you'll also notice there's a purplish hue in the orange rocks. So I brought that. I began to introduce that in the painting. And at one point, it actually looked like it was a cloud bank or a fog bank. And I was thinking of changing it, but I'm thinking, I'm just going to leave it the way it is. And sometimes it's hard to decide, do we do the painting according to the script, or do we make a change? And if that change, or if we did something spontaneously, and I say, hey, that looks cool, I might want to just keep it. So I didn't really change that. I made some modifications to it. Again, there's some more of that complementary contrast. This is a bluish purple um, pastel, and I believe it's a Great American Artworks, and it did quite a good job contrasting with the um, burnt orange of the hoodoos. Now there will be a layer of light at the edge of that rock area that we're going to want to bring in. Just kind of a glow eventually that'll wrap around the edge of those rocks. A little bit of lavender also in that foreground. Then I'll use some pink here, a little bit of paint, mid-value pink to help carve out the twists and turns in those rocks. There's various crevices and edges, etc. So there's some of it there, but kind of capturing some light, and there's put a little more shapeliness to the foreground. We can't really ignore the foreground. It's got to have some detail, but not a whole lot. Again, I didn't want to call it out too much because it will conflict with the hoodoo section. That was just a little bit of light that I added there. Then I decided to fill in my little rock outcrop here using this is a very light mauve uh, Mount Vision pastel. So eventually we'll bring in a little bit of orange in that, and it would almost look like it's glowing in the painting. So again, that was something that wasn't planned, but it just kind of happened that way, and I was pretty happy with that. Again, reviewing the reference photo, adding some more edges, doing a little bit of more of the alcohol wash. At times, as I mentioned before, I would use the wash to darken an area that should show more shade, and then I would apply darker value pastel to it to get that effect. So that does help. Also, that's also a benefit of doing the alcohol wash. Helps spread out the color and also blend it, soften it a bit, so it could drag some of that brown orange down below, but not too much of it. And that's about what we want. And then I'll bring in a little more lighting there lighting there too. It's just that with so many layers in this painting, it's it's important to build the appropriate contrast so that they each show effectively, but they don't take away from each other either. So, as I mentioned, this is a complicated painting. In addition to just the fact that the hoodoos present a bit of a challenge. A little more shade in the foreground. That'll help bring out the light highlights that are being picked up at the edges of that foreground rock hill thing. I should know my geology a little bit better. I should have studied a bit before I recorded this. So I'm gonna tell you, to be honest with you, at this point of the painting, it's pretty dull. It's look how dark it is. It's there's the light value is not that light, and the darks are pretty dark, and it's almost just I wouldn't say like kind of grayscale, but if I bet if I took a grayscale, it would look pretty much grayscale-ish. It would look pretty much gray, very similar value. Um, so it's going to take a bit of time to start building more to this landscape where we will create the uh, better contrasts of value in the painting. We already have a pretty good contrast of hue, so contrast of value to isolate our key layer, which is the hoodoo collection there in the middle. So um, it's it's a bit of an interesting kind of a conundrum, but and I'm sure this happens to many artists. You're doing a painting, you've got I don't know 40% of it done. You look at it and you say, really? I don't know what this is going to look like, and it's is this really good? I don't know, and but you'll be surprised. You just keep working it, and with practice, practice makes perfect, and you'll turn out to something. It'll turn out to something really cool. So, so there's the story. So there's some lighting in the foreground here. I'm bringing that up with uh, it's like a light ochre pastel. Not much color in there though, so I'm going to be adding more color to the foreground, some bright yellows and some grasses and even greenery that'll be in there. And there's a really cool twisted log that I'll bring in that's capturing sunlight also. Going back to the reference photo now, more highlights right around the edge, okay, edge of that valley, edge of the plateau. And a point about reference photos, at some point you don't need the reference photo, and I would suggest you don't look at it any longer because you are the artist and you're not here to replicate something here. You're here to put some more creativity into the painting. So don't look at the reference photo at some point and just add features that you want. By the end of this video, you'll see a version of this painting, and it was not quite the final version because I gave up on the reference photo, but I wanted to add a few changes here and there. So you go to my website, or if you follow me on Instagram, and that information is up. It's called at Bob Palmerton Art, at Bob Palmerton Art for Instagram. You will see the latest version of this painting. So there it is. So the whole thing is covered up. It's now a matter of working back and forth, building a little more detail throughout the painting. What I found interesting in the reference photo is, and I saturated the reference photos slightly, not very much. I didn't want to make it gaudy, but I did saturate it to pick up more color that the photograph just did not capture. And I noticed that there's actually some pretty bold greenery in that distant field. So I'll bring some of that greenery in here in just a moment. But I wanted to kind of get a little more emphasis, a little more variety to the lines in the distance. Uh, that that still I'll keep blending and keep soft, but wanted them to show up a little more strongly. At the excuse me, at the second half of this video, I'll be speeding up the painting. So, feel free to slow it down or make it go faster if you want to get to the end. But I'll be speeding it up, but I think it will still capture the essence of what I'm trying to convey. Here's that greenery now. I'm bringing in and I didn't want it to be too strong again because it is a distance, right? And we really kind of lose that hue the further out we go. So a fair amount of that greenery is in the closer portion, closer to the viewer portion of that middle ground or the distance. So we'll add some of that. The reference photo. So what I like to do with the reference photos, and this was not as part of my video lesson about how to modify digital images, is to hone in, focus it in a specific spot, so enlarge a portion of the photo, and you'll see things because you look at it from a distance and you say, yeah, there's nice color and value and different shapes and sizes and things, but what are they? And often, if you enlarge them on your computer, you'll realize what you're looking at, and that'll help you decide how to handle the next part of the painting. So what I did with this area, this distance, is I did enlarge it significantly so that I can see, really, what is out there. There are actually some homes out there. There are homes and little clusters of trees and more of these little bumps and plateaus, and you got to see more detail of this valley back there. So I did that, and so these changes I'm making, or these updates I'm making to the distance, reflect what I saw in that detail in the reference photo. This deep blue green I'm going to add shortly, uh, right around those, right, I think right around those um, pine trees will also make quite a difference. It's going to be darker. It's coming up shortly. It's going to be darker, and it's going to help add to that contrast of color with the orange. I'll get to that in a moment. A little more spreading and thinning out of the distance. I'll ultimately take a light pink pastel and scumble it uh, vertically from the horizon point to the right of that large plateau in the distance down to help soften things up. Here's the blue-green pastel. As I added this, I realized, hey, wow, that's really cool. And it's adding a bit of chroma back there, which is okay, because what it did is it really started bringing out that orange again of the hoodoos. So I was quite pleased with this. This is another Mount Vision pastel, working the pastel with the side on the side, and and I was pleased with that juxtaposition of color. That was probably my only example of a chromatic color in the, we'll call it the distance. I don't think it's that terribly distant out there, though. It is somewhat. This is a dark tree line, bunch of pine trees, and we'll cut into the rocks a bit, and that'll also show some contrast of color between the dark green and that reddish color that are in the rocks. Interestingly enough, as I think in retrospect, I did not put a lot of red in this painting. It was mostly the oranges, but of course, orange is a combination of red and yellow, so you could get that complementary impact with green and orange. It was time to go back to the rounded hills, and so here I wanted to get a little more highlights on them. They were picking up more sun. There was a little series of hoodoos that kind of connected close to those rounded hills, and continuing on with the blue valley and a little bit of that blue green again added a nice touch as a contrast. Another color type I'd like to use in my atmospheric in the distance is like a blue aqua color. So it has a little touch of that green, which we know we don't see very well way all in the distance, but it does add a nice effect. This is a very light um, orange pastel. Recognize that the lighter your pastel is, the less hue you have in that pastel. So if you had really high value colors laid up against each other, blues, orange, yellow, you'll be able to see on a piece of white paper that they're different colors, but they get kind of lost in a painting. So you want to think about the level of high value color that you have. Same with the dark values too. Really, really dark ones, blues, browns, they lose that hue. And so you want to be conscious of that when you're conveying when you're looking at the values of your painting. At the end of this video, we'll do a grayscale comparison, and I would recommend doing a grayscale comparison while you're working on the painting. And I've done that several times working on this, and I'd go back and say, okay, this section is too dark, this section is too light, looking at the reference photo, and I go back and make modifications. The only caveat is the reference photo itself, darks will be darker than what they really are, as we know, and lights could be lighter. You'll have a sky that's totally washed out. You don't see any clouds in it from the photo, even though there were clouds. So you need to compromise for that too. But going back and doing a grayscale test is very helpful. So a little more detail emphasis there on that plateau in the distance. Those outcrop of rocks and picked up the sunlight, and so far I'm really trying to be true to the reference photo, bringing in a little bit of a very light blue and scumble that over to soften up some other areas. So really creating a lot of variety in the distance and imbalances of highlights and middle value. But look at those rounded hills. They really just don't look like they should be there. They just kind of distract. So we're going to need to work on those a bit, and that was really probably the challenge of the painting. So as I mentioned, when I do a painting, I step back and take notes. Often later in the day, I look at a digital image of the painting, and then I develop a game plan for what areas I want to tackle next. That's why I bounce around to this painting. And at times I'll work on a painting. I'm thinking that it's pretty much done, but I'll leave it around the studio and lay it out there. And all of a sudden I'm realizing I'm working on a different painting, but I've picked up some technique or I'm using some treatment on rocks that are out in the southwest. I say, hey, I want to have that same effect on the painting that I thought I finished, and I'll pick the painting up again and make a modification. And that's okay. You can do that. You can hang on a painting forever. Now, there's some of us who believe, hey, do so much in your painting, and then you got to know where to stop and just stop. And I've been in that camp too, whereby I was doing at one point I was doing a painting a week, and I said, I really enjoy doing these paintings, especially these national park landscapes. So I want to spend more time on them and think about, really understand what I'm painting. And and I got to tell you, I went to Canyonlands National Park, and there's a painting on that on my website that I recently put on Instagram. And I want to go back there and do some hiking because I really just spent my wife and I just spent time at the Overlook, so we didn't do any hiking there. So that'd be a great place to hike. So the lower portion of those plateaus back there are lighter than the tops. Turns out to be, and I think that's just that the sunlight is starting to filter along the landscape at that in that area. So that's where I applied some very light blue also back there. So we are about at the halfway point of the video. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be speeding up portions of this video was literally 3 hours at start, and uh, and that's a bit much. So you can see at least we could share some techniques here and show you what I'm doing in terms of modifying the painting and the landscape with these some of these highlights. This is another highlight, light picked up by the ridges of that plateau, and I'll lighten that up a bit too. I think that pastel is a bit too much on the dark side for that effect, so we could pick up some light on top of that, layer on top of that in a bit. A little more of that light blue to soften up that transition point there to the distance. There we go. So I'm pretty happy with the atmospheric effect of the distance there. I think it's pretty accurate in terms of the reference photo. So the more you study those hoodoos, the more ridges you see, and we needed a little more contrast in there because they're sort of like slices in that particular wall there that I'm working on. So I'm bringing again the my darkest blue pastel just to note where those pieces are. So I'm carving out features of the hoodoos with this Mount Vision pastel, and then I'm going to overlay those dark colors, those dark lines, with a little bit of the a dark orange. I do use black once in a while in my paintings, not too much, but what I do, and you'll see when I go to my pastel pencils, which I will typically go to toward the end of the painting, I'll apply it to certain areas, but then I'll work it over with a color, with a hue. So, like I might do a line with a black pastel, and then bring a deep blue and put that, cover that up so that it doesn't show as black. Really, there is not. When you think about what's black in the landscape, it's like ashes, right? Burnt logs. There's not much else that's really black, so certainly shade's not black. So just beware of using black in your paintings. But here I'm just kind of keeping a little more, doing a little more carving with some of the dark blue. So not a whole lot of detail, just suggesting that there are various nooks and crannies to these rocks and cracks and crevices and you name it, and that's what we want to convey here. So when you study rocks, rocks are a great subject to paint, by the way, with pastel or anything. You can see the gradations of value depending on the source of the light, and so so what I like is the shaded area of rocks where there's a big crack or maybe there's a little cave. And so the cave could be really dark blue, but then let's say the rock is like a mauve color. You can have a very deep value mauve and just slightly just indicating that it's in there and you could barely see it in there because it's in the dark. And that's I would tell you rocks are fun to paint. But now we're getting into the fun part. We want to bring in some more highlights on oranges. We want to get the ridges of this particular part of the hoodoos in place. So we'll spend some time applying some of this color. Reflective light is another item to consider. Um, and I didn't see it so much here at Bryce Canyon or this particular scene, but just as an example, with an orange hoodoo and a sandy, whitish kind of trail, and maybe I should check my reference photos because maybe I will see that. You will find that that sandy white trail has a little bit of that orange glow to it. So the sun is reflecting, all the reflections that are happening in the atmosphere are creating that variety of color. This is a Great American Artworks that I have. It's really effective and a nice soft one that covers real nicely. So I was pleased with this one. And so again, hard strokes here. Side of the pastel is really key. And then I know I'm gonna have to pick up some striations in these rocks and stripes, if you will. So, but that's the Great American right there where I expanded that particular hoodoo, and we'll work that further. There's some shaded areas of that and cracks in it too that we'll add to. So bring a little bit of a darker value to help emphasize or capture some of the other crevices of these rocks. I would suggest, and you'll see what I'll be doing here, is taking highlights on these rocks and building a pattern that draws the viewer's eye through the painting. So you've seen the or heard you may have heard of the concept three dark spots. That's kind of like a compositional concept um, that and there are various compositions. There's the circle composition, the um, various types of compositions of three dark spots in a painting. Kind of you look at it and and it takes you to a certain point, maybe a focal point. Well, with the hoodoos, what you can do, what you'll be seeing is I'll be taking various areas and highlighting one section and then highlighting another section opposite to it, such as that lower left, right where my watch is there. I'll highlight that piece a little bit more, and then something up in the middle, excuse me, I'll highlight somewhat, and and your eyes kind of bounce around, and it helps draw your view into certain areas. There's just so many ways to enhance and also hide edges. Um, Here's the light on that wall section I mentioned before. That's picking up some light, but I'm using a light blue here, and I'll bring a little bit of orange to that too. Um, the purple and orange were comp, nice pictures to colors to lay up against. So I'll have a little bit of purple on that wall too. That pastel there is a very skinny, hard purple pink pastel. It's got a little bit of, I think it has a little bit of gray in it too. Um, and so I use that to help highlight that wall in the back, and it kind of helps separate the orange of the hoodoos from that distance. When I do acrylic underpaintings, again here I'm going to just jump in here. I'm building more contrast of value here. This is a deep green pastel. It's a green, um, I think they're pine trees, cluster of pines at the base of the rounded hills, and they lend the opportunity to present some more significant contrast with between that layer of the painting and the hoodoo layer of the painting. And the shaded dark greens are, of course, the shaded areas, but there's a lighter green also um, in that little forest area there. So there's a little cluster of hoodoos way back there, right at the edge of the rounded hills. So I'll pick those up with that application of Mount Vision. I feel like all I'm doing is a rock carving exercise here. When doing rocks, I like to use a very dark blue pastel pencil to uh, to identify cracks in the rocks, and then bring in some other darker values in the areas too. There's some of that blue green that does well to contrast against the orange. And I'll soften that up a bit. It's a bit sharp, but it also helps draw the viewer into that part of the painting where that is a key um, area of focus. That's another dark orange Mount Vision. I recently got those, as I mentioned, those two sets of Mount Vision landscape set and chromatic, and it's interesting how you could pick up a pastel and it's actually cracked in half, or a third or whatever. But never fret. That's always a good thing because I like to have my pastels in various places. I'll have a like a plein air box, and I can put some of that color in there, or just having a just having other sources of the same pastel is a good thing. Sometimes I would cut up my pastels if I did need one, particularly one that I didn't have that was a full piece and I wanted it on a plein air set, for example. I would do that. So I would cut it with a sharp utility knife, and that usually is quite effective. So that's probably why I have so many pieces of pastels. Any pastel artists have just a bunch of pieces of pastels here and there. A little more of that purple blue lavender color out in the distant hoodoos there, that wall of hoodoos. And we're going to kind of soften that up a little bit of blending with the finger, because I don't want to lose too much of that orange. And again, as I mentioned earlier, kind of felt like almost like a fog bank, but it fit well with the image of the painting because those rocks are of that very light kind of purple hazy color, and I'll put a little more, draw a little more lines in there, a little more crevices in those to help break up some of that purplish color. The foreground hoodoos, that's one there, and then I'll add a few more in a row with a lighter value orange. Okay, those are picking up some light, so that adds a little bit of variety there too. So you can see where the importance of having a nice dark base helped here. That dark blue that I put in for the rose initially, that I then spread out with alcohol, the isopropyl alcohol, the dark values there really laid the groundwork for adding a lot of this bright highlighted orange type colors of the hoodoos. Outlining here that hill in the front, it's picking up light, not a whole lot of light, but in the reference photo, the edges are lit and the light is kind of enveloping around the edges of the rocks. So I want to convey some of that. Just a dab of pastel here and there. There's a mid-value mauve I used also. And it's just to kind of give you the suggestion that, yeah, there's a bunch of rocks and crevices down that way. Don't need to be drawing each of these individually. Just kind of block out some of that color. So time to start working a little more on thinking about those hills now. Um, there past the hoodoos. I decided to bring and this is artist license here, I decided to bring that valley across those hills a bit, even though it's not quite in the reference photo. That actually added a nice effect of contrasting the hues. Notice the section of the painting above that focal point hoodoo there, that orange peak, if you will, there. That's about just to the left of the center of the painting. That muted area of green, greenish blue, had a nice effect of being that it was so soft. The softness of that had a nice effect of contrasting with the hardness and the harshness of the highlighted hoodoo peak. And I'll actually, one of the modifications I made eventually to the painting was I made a note to myself that says, you know what, I want to make that hoodoo peak the tallest of the hoodoos. So we'll kind of expand that a little bit higher later on, and that'll also help emphasize that contrast there with that muted greenish blue area. Here I'm working further on the rounded hills. The left side of those hills are deeply shaded, so I use a deep brown and actually a little bit of purple too in those hills. Again, I didn't want the darks to overwhelm the darks of the hoodoos, um, so we really need to be careful here. But the good thing about it is the shapes are at such a contrast to the sharpness of the hoodoo rocks. So that kind of helped save us from this possibly conflicting part of the painting. And so there's a little bit of the blue I'm going to bring into the shade also, in addition to the dark brown, and softening up those hills. And eventually I'm going to add some of the trees to the hills, which is true to the reference photo. And that'll add a little nice touch to it too, a little bit dark rows of trees. This is also this is one of the Broken Mount Vision pastels. It's a very dark brown pastel. And so this was effective in capturing the shade and the rounded shade of the hills, and also trying to vary the values there to help transition those values from dark to lighter as portions of those hills pick up a little more light. There's a really nice hike you could do here at Bryce Canyon to this lookout point. I think it's only about a mile from one spot where a bus would lead you off, and it's really I think it's called the Rim Trail around National Bryce Canyon National Park, the Rim Trail at the Overlook, Bryce Canyon Overlook. So we want to try to keep things warm. Sometimes when I do highlights and lights, I'm using a color that's a bit too light. As I mentioned before, you really lose the value of the color, the type of color. It's almost like a white. So think about those values again. I'm going to bringing in a little more pinks and a little more orange to some of those spots. I've got a light orange hard pastel I also like to blend with, and eventually I get to my pastel pencils and make some final modifications. So at this point on the rounded hills, I call these the rounded hills. I think by refining them and adding appropriate detail, but not too much, they're kind of losing their conflict with the foreground. But we're going to work that further by building some more highlights in the foreground. So to summarize these hills that we're doing here, it's really a selection of high, medium, and low values allows us to distinguish between the hills, the one, two, three, or four of these hills here, and but by building up the strength of the hoodoos and softening those hills eventually, will help solve that conflict issue. So you think about it. If you do when you do a test small version of your painting, this would show up as one of the challenges. And I did a small version, which I don't think I posted here on this video, and kind of worked it so that I could keep it from being an issue in the final painting. So, but do your homework. Do your homework on the composition, on the values, and doing a small scale version of your painting before you use a large sheet of UArt 400 paper, and you can solve those problems on a small scale, and then do the correct do the better version of the painting on a larger scale. So this here is another mauve kind of color, mid value. Got a lot of mauves in here. I've got my pastels set up so that there's a neutral section, and a lot of the neutrals tend to be about that type of color. Um, so of course, like grays and some tans or so that represent some more neutral colors. So I keep them separated from the more chromatic colors of the spectrum. Here, as I mentioned, that light highlights, I got to add some orange to them because they are glowing. They are picking up an orange hue from the sunlight. It was about, I think it was about 10 o'clock in the morning on a very sunny day, and it was about 80 degrees at Bryce Canyon National Park. And another day when we were in the area, we were driving back, and it was actually snowing. So I've seen 90-degree weather in St. George, Utah, and 30-degree weather up in the mountains. Driving around I think it's the Escalade National Monument um, outside in Utah, near Arizona. So there's some more yellow ochres in here too that I want to bring in. So again, according to the reference photo, I'm just bringing in a little more detail, a little more variety in the foreground portion of these hills, and just working them back and forth. Another thing to consider when designing a painting is what's the format going to be? Is it going to be square, horizontal, or vertical? And with the vast landscapes of the national parks, most of mine are horizontal, um, but there are cases where um, vertical format would be appropriate. And when my wife and I took a hike through the hoodoos, I can't recall the name of the hike, but I think it was a 4 mile hike, and there you were just walking between them and around them and along a trail and through a slot canyon and really interesting places. And there's plenty of opportunities for a vertical type of a format of a painting, of a pastel painting. Here I want to edge a little better, a dark edge against the light edge of the wall at the back of the hoodoos. So that's why I added a little bit of that dark brown. And I've got my very dark and very small dark blue pastel pencil, one of my favorite pastel pencils, and it's shrinking in size every day. But I'm using that again to help highlight again more contrast at the base of those hoodoos there against the light that's picking up at the edge of the rocks. So when I said edges, there's a lot of edges to work with in this painting, and you could just kind of go back and forth and enjoy working with them. So after carving out the deep blue pencil, I'm bringing in that black pastel a little further, again to build contrast. Get that edge of that orange darkened so that it really jumps out at you. And I'm covering up with that blue pastel again. So I don't want to leave the black there alone. I want to put something else in there. And why not a little bit of dark blue in this area and throughout, just to build a little bit of shade behind those orange pastels as well as against the foreground rocks. So at this point, I want to give the rocks a little more shape, not too much detail, but they look kind of flat here. So in the reference photo, there are various ridges in these particular rocks that are picking up light, and then there are crevices also that we want to pick up. And the light is kind of pushing toward the viewer here, toward that dark shaded, grassy, soon to be grassy area. So I brought that light in there and taking our trusty palette knife, blending some of that in. So we want to pick up some of that detail, but not a ton of detail here. Some really bold, strong strokes, side of the pastel, are helping to convey the groupings of the hoodoos. I think of all the little towers of hoodoos in this particular painting, I think maybe three of them have a fair amount of detail. Um, so again, trying to keep a complicated painting somewhat simple, whatever I could do. Some more darks, some more variety. You'll find that, with saturated colors make more sense in the context of other saturated colors. So some of these blues are very saturated, oranges are saturated, so it's kind of a group of, it's like a saturation party, I guess. So they tend to work better, play together better here. A fair amount of the oranges are saturated, and some of the blues, and maybe even a little bit of the greenery that we'll see in a bit that'll add to that foreground, but not a whole lot, not a whole lot of that. Now, when I think about pastels, and if you've participated in pastel juried compositions, think about how you can apply the medium in a creative way. Because what the judges really like to see is they like to see, yeah, that's a great use of pastel. And if you look at work like by Tony Elaine, you'll see what he does with pastel and the colors and the rough strokes and bold marks and all that good stuff. I tend to be, I've got some of those painterly, we'll call those painterly pastels, and really exuding the value of the medium, some of those paintings. This is more of a traditional landscape that an oil painter could do, even though I work on pastels. So when you think about the competitions, think about how you can create a painting that's a unique use of the pastel, or a use of the pastel that's really meant for the medium. This is probably the area of painting that I really spent a fair amount of time building that detail. Again, keeping up with those vibrant blues. That's a pretty chromatic kind of a blue mount vision there to help separate out those hoodoos. So shortly I'll be getting to that cool rock outcrop because it's been, as you can see, it's been haven't touched it, and we've been kind of working around it. So that'll provide, we'll say, a another focal point. If you want two focal points in a painting, that one could count. But notice on the composition, and again I'm bringing in some more contrast with that dark blue pastel there, and also helps bring out the edge of the foreground rock structure. But notice so if we take the rock outcrop that I'll be working on shortly, that's right behind my hand, and the peak hoodoo up toward the left of the center of the painting, and then you look at the valley way back there that looks like a river. You really got to have the opportunity to bring that viewer all the way out to that horizon, and maybe back around again. So I was pretty pleased with the layout of the composition. Again, something that you could demonstrate in doing your homework ahead of time. So, but it came in really handy. Got to add a little more orange to that purple lavender color mist that's sitting in the rocks up at the main part of the hoodoos there. It's about at the stage where I tend to bring on some more pastel pencils, and I could literally have like six pastel pencils in one hand, and I'll pick one and then the other and the other and the other, and go back and forth. It's kind of like a nice finishing touch. The reference photo, I did take a bit of a divergence from the reference photo. It actually has a lot more rows of hoodoos, and it's a lot more complicated. It's got hoodoos going in one direction, and then it got some going in another direction, and they kind of connect with a little piece of a wall. I had a little bit of that, but not a whole lot. I kind of focused more on just getting some major two or three major rows here of these fantastic rocks. Hoodoos are irregular columns of rocks, and they exist on every continent, by the way. But the hoodoos at Bryce National Park is the largest concentration found anywhere on Earth. So you got to go. You got to go there. It's situated along a high plateau at the top of the Grand Staircase. The park's high elevations include numerous life communities, fantastic dark skies, which is something to check out, and geologic wonders. This dark pastel came in real handy to help define those rows. So I'm bringing a bit of it more back here, and as you could see now, what's happened in the painting is this whole section is a lot stronger now, a lot harsher than the other portions, the other layers of the painting. So we're defining again the layers of the painting is the foreground rock, that lightish rock there, along with the trees, the pine trees in the foreground, and that contrast, the hoodoos, and then the middle to distance. Even those rounded hills, maybe we'll call that the middle and distance. Well, it is actually the middle, but that's another layer too. Again, more of the highlights. Here's where we're picking up more direct sunlight on the left there, and separating out those hoodoos with the so-called wall in the distance, which at some point in time, if you take I don't know, 1,000 years from now, this will look a little bit different based on due to the erosion at the park. So the park itself, over 2 million visitors come and experience this other world. It's kind of like another planet, I think. So um, you could visit in a few hours and go to the main sites. You could spend some time hiking. Um, there's plenty of great hikes around the park. Again, we want to scatter some of that highlight. It's not evident everywhere. It's not bold everywhere. So you're going to see various, and you could just apply the same pastel but a little bit lighter, not such a hard mark um, for to create a little a head hoodoo in a shaded area. Get a little more work on that wall in the back. And if you haven't noticed, I did speed up the film a bit here. Also, those highlights, those light purple highlights at the tops of the hoodoos, as you can see there, it's very similar to what's seen in the reference photo, and also helps pull them out and distinguish them from other rows of hoodoos. So as I mentioned, Bryce Canyon National Park has a night sky program, and it's a great night sky out there. And also does they have full moon hikes and ranger events. Now it's time to work on that rock outcrop. I've been looking forward to this point here. This is a very light blue Mount Vision, and I'm going to start blocking in some of the capturing of the sunlight from the right, and it's a bit of the sunlight is kind of bouncing out alongside that ridge of that foreground rock outcrop. Opportunity to work the distance behind it to help build uh, uh, edging and to help pull out the edges. This particular rock I left with a very hard edge, a strong edge because of that dark in the distance and the highlights along its edges. And I brought in a little bit of a light blue in this rock, and a little bit of has a little bit of orange in it, and so now with that highlight, and we'll even make it a little bit lighter eventually. It'll match up with the lighting in the peak hoodoo that will wrap up soon in the center, or to the right, to the left of the center of the painting. So here's a little bit of that blue, lightish blue color, the shade there. So it kind of like has like an aura around it. There you go. So there were 59 species of mammals that reside in Bryce National Park. There's getting back to the painting, a little bit of darker blue, dark shade in parts of the rocks. Again, not a whole lot of detail in this particular rock, but we do have a variety of edges that we should properly convey, and that's what I'm doing here. This is a little bit of a lighter blue, harder blue pastel. There's that lighting change in the studio that I mentioned. So hopefully we'll get that fixed for the next time. So if you venture out and to do much hiking at Bryce National Canyon, you could possibly run into mule deer, pronghorn, a golden mantled ground squirrel. That'd be cool. Watch out for the mountain lions, chipmunks, prairie dogs, a badger, seemed to have relocated from Wisconsin, and the black bear. So plenty of variety, including bats and Rocky Mountain elk are also possible to run against run across at Bryce Canyon National Park. So a little more orange hue in here in the glow from the sun. Got more orange, a little bit of orange on that rock outcrop as well as in the other portions of that large rock here, and bringing some of that orange into the shade shaded areas of the tree line because we know we have some of that reddish orange, burnt orange color from the rocks in that area, even though a fair amount of it is hidden by the shade as well as grasses, etc. I like using pastel pencils to help scumble some light across too. I've got a very light um, orange, kind of whitish pastel pencil I use to help create an overlap of warmth in some areas of my paintings. Kicking up some of that color here with some blue in the shaded area, again reflecting some of the different contour of this hill. As you can imagine, with all these hoodoos and places to hide and hang around, there are a lot of birds. A lot of birds at Bryce Canyon National Park. We've got hawks and eagles and falcons and crows and jays and owls, finches and swallows and bluebirds and great variety of birds. Pink pastel here. It's kind of like a dark pink, and um, just to add a little bit of flavor to the warmth here. A little more warmth, but a little more contrast. As I mentioned, I like the combination of blue and pink, and this gave me a nice opportunity to use it here on this rock structure. The foreground, as I mentioned, has more shrubs and grasses, but there's also more trees. And so I thought that those three pine trees were enough, but looking again at the reference photo, there is a tree that kind of crops out at that point where I'm just working that little ledge. And here's my tree. Looks like it just grew all by itself, didn't it? And I'm building up the structure of the tree with a very dark green pastel, and I'll work some of the highlights of that tree with a lighter green pastel where it's capturing some of that sunlight. So let's get that completed here. And then with that tree being done, the reference photo also has some small trees, shrubs growing in the hills in this foreground rock. So we'll plant some of those in the rock. And what's interesting about that is that'll create a fair amount of contrast and help also draw the viewer by looking at the pattern of rocks, pattern of shrubs in that large rock. further out toward the focal point. So we'll do a bit of that also in just a moment. But I wanted to add more detail, a little more color to the foreground. Um, so bringing in some of the orange, and later on, and I'm not sure the video captures this, I made some adjustments to the very much foreground. There were some grasses, tall grasses at the edge of that foreground there that were picking up some sunlight. So I added that, and I added a little bit of color, and I broke up what appears to be like two. To see those parallel light lines in the foreground, I broke those up too at the end of the day. Here comes this tree, just a little bit taller, and now that's funny. I just realized that I had a reversed video piece here. So you saw the tree being created and then denuded and then created again. So we're gonna go and build those other trees in the rocks very shortly. The fun thing about trees, painting trees, is you can take that dark shaded area and layer on a mid value for the branches that are not in direct sunlight and a lighter value. Some of them are just picking up light from others, but it gives it more depth, and that's really the key with pastel painting, is starting off with that dark value and then going forward and building on top of the value. So sometimes like a blue green works fairly well with pines. There's also some red in pines. I didn't convey them here, but there's some deep brown reddish color in pine trees, and again blue green is nice, and some of the pines also you'll have that yellow green in them also. So take a look at it's the type of pine that you're dealing with, and it's the lighting that you're dealing with. And speaking of lighting, if you're going to rearrange a painting, say you're going to take an element from one reference photo and add it to your painting, which has a different reference photo, think about the lighting and make sure the lighting is consistent. Here's this log that was laying in that foreground that was picking up nice lighting, not too strong, but it almost looked like a snake, and I found it rather interesting. So I wanted to make sure I put that in the foreground, and that kind of also points to the direction of the focal point. Looks like that also disappeared, so there must be a reversal of some of the. There we go. This video was done over a week, and it comprised about 30 different videos put together. So putting together some a couple of pieces were put in backwards, I guess. So fortunately, we fixed that with the technology that we're using, and next time you won't see that happen again like magic. More highlights here at the edge of the grasses. Again, I will bring in more color to those too, but right now let's just get them in place. Another edge yet to convey in the painting, and some strokes. Just you're going to stroke something like a grass, start from the bottom and go up, and you can even take the pastel pencil and help, not the pastel pencil, but the plastic palette knife, and spread things out and spread out the grasses too. So again, a little more blending in here to wrap up this foreground. So going back to the hoodoos, I found this mauve color that I'm adding in now. It's a mid-value mauve, and I thought that worked pretty well in the slightly shaded areas of the hoodoos. And notice, I don't have straight lines of hoodoos. They're jagged. They go in different directions. They're coming back toward us here from that wall that edges up there, up to the left. So we want to vary the direction of them, and they're really all over the place. And but um, no need to be terribly detailed in doing this. A little more blending and getting the values to merge better with each other. So really, at this point, I'm helping that working on still building a little more contrast back and forth, laying in highlights to the various areas of the painting, just going back and forth. So if you do visit Utah, by visiting Utah, you can also go to Arches National Park, and that's really fantastic, and some wonderful, very long hikes too. You could go for. And there's Canyonlands, which I had mentioned earlier, was fantastic. Canyonlands has a wonderful observation trail section, which with a really vast expanse of view, and it's an in and out trail, circular trail, up way up high, and it's a great little trip, a great little detour to take if you get to go there. Then there's Capitol Reef National Park, which is also fun, and then closer to um, St. George is Zion National Park, which is um, probably the most interesting of the national parks in Utah, and some fantastic hikes. And they have a bus service there that takes you back and forth. It's near Springdale, Utah, and it could be very crowded too, depending on the time of the year. Here I'm adding the greenery that I had mentioned to those rounded hills there, and that also kind of helped remove their emphasis a bit because the green again contrasted kind of nicely with the orange red of the hoodoos. So I thought this effect was useful, kind of going back and forth in this painting. So the age-old question is, when do you know when you're done with a painting? And you get to the point where you're making an adjustment here and there, and you're saying, well, an adjustment is not adding much to the painting, and that's pretty much the time when you say, hey, Kate, it's pretty much done. So I wanted to light up some of that blue in the background there. It was a bit too sharp, so made a bit of a change in there and a little more dark shade on the left edge of the rounded hills. Stefan Ballman is another famous landscape artist, and he paints in oils, and he's got 12 key points in art. He says, is the concept worth painting? Okay, that's one thing to think about. I definitely thought this was worth painting, so I had to do this one. Um, think about your central focal point, and it could be an effect. It doesn't have to be an object. Composition, break it into thirds, foreground, middle, and distance. Well, we've got lots of foreground, middle ground, and distances in this painting, or a lot of layers, if you will. Think about the value and the temperature of light in the value, the color, the brush strokes. Think about pastels and how you might want to maximize the use of that particular medium. The edges, good hard edges around the focal point. Certainly there are hard edges around the rock outcrop there that you could see, and there's pretty hard edges in the distance, which we'll kind of work on a little bit further later on. Transitions and how the intense light softens up and into a shaded area and how you handle that. Drawing, pastels is technically drawing, and even though we're using the side of the pastels, is it technically correct? Is your drawing good? Perspective, aerial and linear perspective. And so this is kind of like a high level view. This is kind of like an aerial view of Bryce Canyon's overlook at Bryce Canyon National Park. Know where your horizon is. Well, I think it's pretty clear. Point number 11. And memorization. Stefan says, learn by practicing. Just keep painting, and you'll really refine, you'll hone your skills, and you'll pick up more. You'll learn how to observe the landscape differently too, which is just a blast. As you kind of you look at trees a certain way, you look at rocks a certain way, and uh, and that all really adds value to the experience. So then I think Pastel Journal did a story on jury duty, what jurors look for. They look for revelation, communication, and celebration, lifting one's spirits with a painting. I feel like this lifts my spirits when I look at it. And then there's certainly main criteria of drawing, design, execution, and expression. The fundamentals of drawing, are they there? The design elements, the lines, the color, the value, the shape, form, texture, the space, and balance, movement, proportion. I like to see movement in my paintings. I don't know if this one has a lot of movement, but I think the rock outcrop and some of the highlights kind of convey a little bit of action and activity. And I think that helps in this particular painting. Painting should have an impact on you. It should produce a feeling or a thought. Um, so, kind of like that wow factor. And just be skillful. Keep practicing and learning. Take classes. Combine composition, color, technique, and subject matter in a manner that conveys a sense of individuality in your paintings. We all have our own styles, and really work hard on your style. Make your body of work should feel pretty consistent. This is that very light pastel I'm using again in the distance. I think this one is a lighter blue, and ultimately also take a bit of a gray and layer that on and soften things up there. Softening up the rounded edges of the rounded hills. Some more nuances and edging on the plateaus with some lighter value. Doing a little more blending. And this is really where I'm beginning to soften up those rounded hills even a little bit further to separate them back, push them back a bit from the strength of the section of the hoodoos. Notice the angle that I'm pushing the the palette knife is more an up and down and more of a diagonal direction to show the impact of the light from the horizon enveloping over that distant land way back toward the horizon. A little more contrast against the main hoodoo focal point. Now I'm trying to make it just a little bit taller, bringing a little more volume to that focal point. And of course, that Great American Artworks very bright orange comes in handy to really pull it all together. And that particular section of that wall of hoodoos was a really large um, rock, and it had a number of crevices, different values, darker values of orange and deep browns, and a little bit. Another color I've used in here, which I haven't mentioned, is a very deep red purple color, almost like a very deep magenta, I might call it. That has come in handy with this particular color composition. Here's that shift in that studio lighting I mentioned before. Get that fixed for next time. And trying to bring out a little more of the orange highlights of those distant hoodoos next to the rounded hill. Being true to the rock structures, there are striations, there are horizontal bands, different colored bands along the rocks. So I want to make sure I capture some of that. Not a whole lot of detail, but A little bit of that is there's some little pinkish bands, some purplish bands. So I'll bring those in, a little more highlights up against that dark green tree line behind the hoodoos, which adds some more edge emphasis and strength of the edges. So when we do our pastels, and here's some of the horizontal lines I'm adding in here. Any artwork is think in terms of value masses and color shapes. And the uh, an artist Mastering Composition by Ian Roberts. Mastering Composition by Ian Roberts is another book to look into. That's that very light blue again that I'm using in the distance, by the way, to make more haze back there. But anyway, he would talk about a bunch of armatures, um, different shapes, and diagonals offset by horizontals and vertical lines, and very interesting book to take a look at. Radiating lines, the fulcrum, using some of the key compositional points. You might want to take a look at that point. That's a pink hard pastel, by the way, that brought a little more haze to the distance. But anyway, Ian Roberts' Mastering Composition is a useful book for any artist to have in their collection. So the tips of the hoodoos have also a little more light, and it's sort of almost like a like a lavender color in the reference photo. So the lavender pastel that I have, which is a Great American, I'm applying a bit there, and I'll bring a little bit of orange back into there. So compared to the reference photo, you'll see that there uh, are just two main rows of hoodoos in this particular painting, going in slightly different directions, but not overly complicated. That was a Sennelier pastel. I would typically use, Senneliers are very soft pastels. Schminke's, I think, are the softest that I've come across. And of course, the Senneliers they come in very handy to layer on some final details. The Mount Visions they're a soft pastel, but they're medium soft. They're a bit on the hard side. So they're really handy for blocking in major shapes. So, but the edges of them are effective in layering on additional detail. So, something else to consider there in your choice of pastels. Often when I'm starting a painting, I'll start it off with a hard pastel, some old new pastels I've got that I could use, and you could get a lot of the color and the shapes there just as a baseline, and that's where some of the alcohol washes help to spread that out into the paper. A little more blues and darks in the background again to help firm up those edges because I really like how the edges are turning out here. Um, really both from that foreground rock structure as well as to the end of the hoodoos when they meet up with the like that dark green tree area. Here I'm adding some of the trees on that rock structure. There were several of them in the reference photo. I didn't want to do too many of them to make it too distracting and give it a little bit of a light green there because that one is picking up more light than the tree there in the foreground and the additional trees and shrubs that I'm adding now. This is just a dark green pastel that I'm using for those. little more shapes to the main rocks come in handy. Again, a lot of finishing touches, and as I mentioned before, the question is when do you think you're done? And if you come to the point where you're making some changes and it's not making a whole lot of a difference, sometimes it's just a personal preference that you just might want to make a change here and there, but and sometimes it's just not that necessary, and you could decide to stop doing your painting at that point. Some the Pastel Journal wrote an article about what jurors were looking for, and a number of PSA jurors shared their thoughts. This one is from Brian Bailey, and he had said, "I look for a strong design and compelling use of tonal and color relationships. After that initial viewing, I hone in on the quality and skillfulness of marks and drawing. Finally, the use of pastel as a unique medium is part of my critical assessment." So there's a case if you're going to participate in a pastel critique, pastel um, juried exhibition, think about the using the medium the way it's meant to be. So the bluish lavender kind of color in those hoodoos in the back, behind them and in the reference photo, there's a little more dark crevices in there, some more highlighted areas too. So I used a lighter pink there to stroke that up into the rock structure. Again, as I mentioned, pastel pencils come in really handy. It's good to have a full set of pastel pencils, and you could carve out a little more detail with them. They last a long time, except for my little blue one that's almost gone, and they layer pretty well for pretty nice for highlighting. Again, they're really good with if you're into portraits and animal um, paintings. Another PSA juror, Liz Haywood Sullivan, said, encourage artists to just enter their best work. Don't overthink it. If you have several pieces you wish to enter, then do it. If you only have one, then enter the one. That's always a challenge to think which pieces to enter and to narrow down the scope. But it's really what the PSA looks for is the Pastel Society of America looks for a body of work that has consistency in it, so that if a juror saw your painting, they know you're the one who did it, and you could see that with so many artists, oil painters as well as pastel artists. You could see that, hey, that's this particular artist or that particular artist, and it's pretty obvious. So that's where the body of work and the consistent body of work comes in handy. Ever so often, just doing a few more highlights here and there, the tips of the hoodoos and some of the pieces of outcrops of rocks on the hoodoos, and the just going back and forth with the middle ground and the foreground, and just wrapping up all these details. I would encourage also artists of all types to kind of settle in on a certain type of painting you like to do, landscapes, florals, and sizes too. It's nice to be more consistent on your sizes. That helps, and certainly with pastel painting with the framing. If you stick with like two main sizes and that's all you do. That final hoodoo or that focal point hoodoo in the background, now I'm expanding that a little bit, making it a little bit wider to build emphasis. So again, we see the light whitish outcrop in the foreground, and you bounce on over to the center of the painting, just about at the center, to the right, to the left of center, to the main hoodoo back there, to we'll call it the hoodoo tower, and then that kind of draws you through the valley, which you could think of as a river also, but it is a valley, out to the distance. So here's the grayscale comparison of the final painting. Pretty close. I made the foreground part a little bit lighter and even the distance a little bit lighter. Remember, your photograph is not going to be perfect in terms of the proper values where darks will be almost black. Here's where you reach me. Email is there, my website, and follow me on Instagram at Bob Palmerton Art. And thank you for visiting and spending these couple of hours taking a look at this demo.